which is Meenakshi Khosla. Meenakshi, are you ready? Oh, you're muted. Hold on. Let me unmute you. There we go.
Okay. I believe you can see my screen now. Hello?
Yes, it looks beautiful. All right. Take it away.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Megan, and thank you all for joining this session. I'm very excited to be here to talk about my recent work in this talk, which is titled Hypotheses, Neutral Response Optimized Models of Higher Order Visual Cortex Reveal Strong Semantic Selectivity. And this is joint work with Professor Leela Webe. So I'll start with a brief background and motivation behind this work. A lot of prior work in visual neuroscience has been focused on characterizing neuronal response properties in different visual areas to understand how the brain encodes incoming sensory information. And a number of different approaches have been used in the field so far for this purposes. So one of the more classical common approaches is what might be best described as a stimulus-committed approach, in which basically subjects are presented with a pre-selected stimulus set, and then the goal is to determine which among these stimuli maximizes the brain responses. And this approach has been instrumental in the discovery of various category-selective regions within the brain. For example, regions that selectively respond to faces, places, words, or body parts. And it's one of the most intelligible approaches because it indicates that the brain response represents the perceptual features that are common among the pre-selected stimuli to which it is maximally tuned. And it's a powerful approach for gaining a conceptual understanding of the visual system. Then there are the modeling approaches that not just characterize the tuning properties, but they also model them. And so these approaches are used to provide quantitative descriptions of a voxel's responses, and they are also capable of predicting brain responses to unseen stimuli. And an important feature of this approach is the use of naturalistic images and videos to drive activity in the visual cortex, followed by the use of encoding models, each embodying its own hypothesized response function. For example, a low-level Gabor wavelet model versus a semantic encoding model to test different hypotheses about neuronal tuning axes. And most recently, researchers have relied on the success of deep learning for extracting stimulus features to build encoding models. And these image computable models have set new standards for predicting brain responses throughout the ventral visual pathway. And one way in which these deep neural network models of the visual cortex can facilitate understanding of the neuronal tuning axis is through post hoc stimulus optimization procedures. For example, by evolving stimuli to maximize the predictive responses and then probing the perceptual qualities of these most activating stimuli. Importantly, while all of these approaches have been instrumental in advancing our understanding of the visual system, all of them are deeply rooted in preconceived hypotheses. So in the stimulus-committed approaches, the hypothesis governs the selection of the narrow range of stimuli and task parameters. In the second inductive system identification approach, the hypotheses are formulated in terms of an explicit feature space. And in the modern task-optimized network, the top-down goal constrains or imposes a strong structure on the emergent representations. But more often than not, the space of likely functions that a neuronal population might perform or the behaviors that it might support is unknown. So pinning down a couple of hypotheses and then devising data-driven experiments to separate them is likely to be suboptimal and prone to future refutation. So in this study, we ask, how can we characterize response properties in the high-level visual cortex systematically and hopefully exhaustively in a hypothesis-neutral or a less hypothesis-committed fashion? And one hypothesis-neutral approach, which we propose to use in this study, is response optimization. That is fitting model parameters of a neural network to reproduce the measured stimulus-response relationship directly. And this approach has minimal a priori biases, and it brings neuroscience data directly to bear on the model development and fitting process. Thus, it's likely to be much more flexible and effective in understanding tuning properties throughout the visual system. And we couple this approach with a novel model interpretability technique to systematize the descriptions of what single voxels encode and represent. And before describing our approach and results, I also want to highlight what I think is a significant advance within the field of human vision research, which is what we are capitalizing on in this study. And that is the availability of a high quality, large scale data set, which is what Arya already described before. But it basically consists of whole brain fMRI measurements from 8 subjects while they viewed 10,000 natural images each over the course of tens of scan sessions. And so understanding how how the human brain encodes natural images is likely to require extensive sampling of stimulus variation, because natural scenes are very high dimensional, and this data set provides exactly that, like large number of complex natural scenes with extensive stimulus variation and high number of object classes per image. And in this study, we leveraged this data set to train deep neural network models directly to predict the brain activity related to viewing natural images. So we optimized neural networks starting from scratch to predict the recorded activity in the voxels of a given ROI. And we focus on modeling voxel level responses in 4 visual category selective regions: the fusiform face area, the extrastriate body area, the visual word form area, and the retrosplenial cortex, which is the place selective area. And we train separate models for each of these ROIs, and the network therefore learns to represent images in a way that is optimal, hopefully optimal for predicting the responses in these ROIs. And we use rotation equivalent convolutional neural network architecture to learn this representational space from brain activity data. And we employ a linear readout on top of this feature space that is shared across subjects to predict the responses of individual voxels. And this linear readout is further kind of factorized into spatial and feature dimensions to separate feature tuning from visual field biases. And we trained the network on about 35,000 image stimuli and corresponding brain response measurements with a mask mean squared error loss, which accounts for the fact that images are mutually exclusive across subjects. So these 3 things, sharing the representational core network across subjects, sharing filter weights across visual field locations and orientations, and a factorized readout, jointly enable sample efficient training of these response optimized models. And we were first interested in investigating the quantitative advantages of learning the feature space of each visual area directly from the neural responses of 4 subjects. So the figure on the top shows the voxel-wise prediction accuracy of response-optimized models on the flat maps, and which is measured using the Pearson's correlation coefficient between the predicted and the measured responses on these 4 subjects. And we can see we can achieve a very high raw correlation coefficient, like greater than 0.6 in a large number of voxels. And we also looked at the noise normalized correlations within all of these 4 ROIs. And we see that we can get values of between 0.6 and 0.7, which indicates that these models are also quantitatively very precise. And we also compared the prediction accuracy of these models against state-of-the-art task-optimized models and baseline categorical models that find an optimal linear mapping between image level binary category labels and the measured brain responses. And so we first find that both the response optimized and the task optimized networks outperform the categorical models, which indicates that trivial category membership indicators are insufficient to produce high predictive accuracies. And importantly, we also see that the response optimized network performs on par with the state-of-the-art task optimized models that have been trained on million images in predicting brain responses. So, which indicates that they can offer an alternative tool to study visual representations. Next, we also wanted to test the generalization of these models to a new set of subjects that was not used during the model fitting process. So for this, we train only the linear readout while keeping the representational core network fixed. And we vary the amount of stimulus response pairs from the new subjects that are used to train the linear readouts from only 100 samples to about 5,000 samples. And the performance improvement between the response optimized models and the task optimized models becomes much more striking as we limit the number of stimulus response pairs, where the response optimized networks generalize much more efficiently to new subjects. And so after establishing that the proposed data-driven approach is empirically adequate, we also sought to interpret these models. And importantly, since any features that emerge in these response-optimized networks are the result of optimization to match the neural targets, once the models are trained, we can go beyond simple quantification of their predictive power and probe the learned features to shed light on the characteristics of these computational models and the cortical populations that they model. And we were inspired by the recent network dissection technique. And we wanted to generate verbal explanations for the behavior of model neurons, which serve as these synthetic voxels. And our goal was to basically measure the degree of alignment between a voxel's response properties and against a large visual concept dictionary that spans not just objects, but also other fine-grained categories like parts of objects, materials, and textures. And just to enable the network dissection procedure to be applicable to our models, we first discard the learned spatial selectivity of every voxel, and we use this learned feature tuning for every voxel to create an independent convolutional layer. And so with this trick, we can align the goal of understanding the response properties with the goal in computer vision research of understanding units in a convolutional layer. And we can quantify the agreement between each concept and individual voxel using an IOU metric that captures the alignment between two binary maps, one corresponding to high-level concepts labeled at the individual pixel level by an oracle, and the second is the binary map that highlights the spatial regions within the image that are activated by the convolutional unit corresponding to a voxel. And this results in an alignment value for every voxel and concept pair. And this quantification is performed on an independent large-scale probe dataset that comprises a diverse uh, amount of the types of environments that we typically encounter in the real world. And so we first looked at the top 20 visual concepts that are rank ordered by the median IOU metric across all voxels within each ROI. And we find that the top concepts that are discovered for each of these ROIs, they align remarkably well with the known domain specificity of voxels in these regions. For example, in the case of FFA, we see best alignment with the head concept, which is a useful proxy or synonymous with faces. In the case of visual word film area, we see the highest alignment with signboards, which mostly contain words. In the case of the EBA, we see alignment with persons, which comprises body parts as well. And in the case of RSC, we see the highest alignment with windows and other scene relevant concepts like buildings, etc. And we also looked at the number of unique detectors that emerge in each of these response optimized networks. That is the number of units in the voxel layer that showed high alignment with a particular semantic concept. Unlike object recognition networks, which are trained with explicit label supervision and which show a broad variety of detectors, we see that the units in these response optimized networks are very specific and aligned with the previously hypothesized functional role of these ROIs. So, for example, in the case of FFA, we see about 2,000 head detectors and just mostly head detectors. In the case of visual word form area, we again see signboard detectors as well as head detectors, which is presumably because there's also significant overlap between the visual word form area and the FFA. In the case of EBA, also we see person detectors. In the case of RC, we see window detectors again. And I'm also showing the results of applying the dissection procedure on random networks just to kind of illustrate that the emergence of these high-level semantic concept detectors is solely a result of optimization to match the neural targets rather than a random initialization. And just to reiterate, these networks are solely optimized with brain data and they have not received any label supervision of any sort. But despite this, we can get very high quality face, word, and body detectors with this kind of response optimization procedure. And we can also zoom in on these detectors and visualize the activation of single voxels in response to an input image. And this is visualized as the region in the input space that elicits the highest activation in the corresponding filter output. And we can see that in the case of FFA, we can very nicely segment out the faces, again, without any label supervision. In the case of visual word form area, again, we see that it responds to text in different backgrounds, fonts, colors, styles, irrespective of the clutter. And we can very nicely segment out words again from these naturalistic images. In the case of EBA, we can segment out body parts or whole people from these images. And in the case of RSC, we see a lot of windows, which we speculate might be just linked to navigational affordances or rectilinearity. And then, so far we've performed a functional analysis that is like feature verbalization by dissecting the network activations. And we also performed an unconstrained optimization over input noise to discover the input that would result in maximal activation of individual voxels. And even despite this unconstrained optimization, we see that the optimized images still contain human recognizable patterns. For example, full face-like features emerge in the case of FFA, and some kind of like images that resemble body parts emerge for EBA. For visual word familiar, we see curves and lines of different stroke widths, and in the case of RSC, we see rectilinear features and like window-like features in different reference frames, which may be linked to RSC's role in spatial cognition. And we're also interested in testing whether developing this selectivity requires experience with the unique form and structure of the preferred stimuli. So we also trained these response optimized networks with a visual diet that was completely deprived of the person category. So training under this regime did not involve any experience with faces or body parts. But despite this, we see that the units and models of FFA and EBA still retain their strong selectivity for faces and bodies, suggesting that semantic selectivity could arise independent of experience, independent of domain-specific experience, and merely as a byproduct from tuning by experience with generic non-specific natural images. And finally, we also wanted to test existing accounts of functional specialization, which implicate FFA in face perception, particularly face identity discrimination, and RSC in spatial layout estimation. And so in the first case, the goal is to predict the correct facial identity from a subset of the celebrity dataset. And in the second, the goal is to predict the correct room layout type, where the room layout categories are defined using a key point-based parametrization. And we extracted the representations from each response optimized network for independent stimuli, and then we trained linear classifiers for these two tasks. And this figure shows the transfer performance of different response optimized networks on these two tasks. And first, we observed that the FFA representations outperform all of the other neural models in the face individuation tasks, providing novel evidence for the role of FFA in face identification. And second, we found that the RSC representations achieved the best spatial layout estimation accuracy. Which is again highly suggestive of the role of RSC in spatial cognition. Thus, we see that the sole objective of reproducing neural targets without any task-specific supervision can also grant these networks intriguing functionalities. And so in conclusion, here we exploited a completely data-driven hypothesis-neutral computational modeling approach to place decades worth of prior work on functional specialization using reductionist approaches and abstract simple stimuli on firmer grounds of naturalistic relevance and broad generalization. And just to summarize the key takeaways, here we showed that our response-optimized computational models can accurately predict brain responses, sometimes even outperforming the task-optimized models. They can reveal semantic selectivity and functional associations of different visual areas. And finally, they can also elucidate the role of experiences in developing categorical selectivity. And thank you so much, and I'd be happy to take any questions if you have time.
Thank you, Meenakshi. That was a fantastic talk. What a whirlwind through some really interesting results. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. We do need to move on to the next talk, but please use the Ask a Question box at the bottom of your screen if you do have questions, or go to the Discord server to continue the conversation.